All right, as I prefaced at the beginning of the hour, we've got a good friend of mine who is a pollster, and he's going to come on the line with us. We've got Chris Wilson. He's the CEO. Let me put on my glasses since I'm an old man now. Chris Wilson is the CEO of Wilson Perkins Allen Research. He is the former Director of Research, Analytics, and Digital Strategy, 2016 Ted Cruz presidential campaign. Chris Wilson is the CEO of Wilson Perkins Allen, a research firm specializing in impacting behavior by integrating innovative predictive analytics with advanced statistical and communications modeling. Now, here's the thing that's really interesting to me. As the Director of Research, Analytics, and Digital Strategy for the 2016 Ted Cruz presidential campaign, Wilson is widely credited for playing a key role in Cruz's triumph in Iowa. Wilson used a meticulous, technology-advanced, and highly individual approach to reaching voters and predicting behavior based on ideological segments, personality types, and the issues important to them. Chris Wilson, how are you, my friend?
Good, man. Thanks for having me on.
Hey, I thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule. You know, I wanted to have you on because I do a segment with Mark every Tuesday, and one of the things that we were talking about with some of the callers were polling. And I want to get this age-old question out of the way now because we hear it all the time, and I've even said it. People say that pollsters have never called me. So how do I know that what you're doing is accurate? Can you explain a little bit to the folks out there how polling is accurate and how and why we should rely on them?
Well, that would take more time than we probably have to be on here. That's sort of like saying I've never been struck by lightning, so I don't believe lightning is real. I mean, it is, but there's good polling and there's bad polling. There's no question about that, Chris. And the problem that exists today from a political campaign standpoint is that good polling is becoming more and more difficult to conduct. And that creates a situation where, and it's also becoming more and more expensive to conduct. And so what that does, it just creates an overall situation where you've got a lot of campaigns and a lot of polling firms that are putting out bad data. And they're doing it, I would say, not for nefarious reasons. They don't do this to be wrong. They just don't want to spend the money to do it right. I mean, it costs a lot of money now to do a good poll. And the kind of survey that when I first started in this industry would cost $3,000 to $5,000 to conduct is now $15,000 to $20,000.
Mm-hmm.
And you know that just from your involvement in campaigns. And that is not because we want to charge more. It is, I mean, frankly, our profit on it's about the same.
Right.
It is because of the need to call cell phones. And there's some districts in America where right now we have to call 60% of our sample by cell, and that gets incredibly expensive.
Right.
And so all that really factors into an overall scenario that has driven up the cost. And so you've got the campaigns that are wanting to spend less money saying, well, let me just go do an IVR survey, which is those robopolls.
Right.
Or let me just go do a small sample survey. And it leads to a situation where there's a lot of bad polls that are being talked about in the media that are not representative of what actually is going to happen on Election Day.
Got it. Now, I know you're a professional pollster, and you don't want to disparage other companies or other polls, but there's one poll that is continually being mentioned, and it's a poll that has consistently had Donald Trump ahead 2 or 3 points from months ago, and that is the LA Times poll. I'm sure you're probably familiar with that. Do you know why that poll seems to be kind of an outlier and has Donald Trump ahead? And it's Los Angeles Times, so in people's minds, they would kind of think, well, that they're liberal. They wouldn't be doing anything to help Donald Trump.
You know, it is, it's a different type of methodology. And it is, I don't know that's necessarily wrong so much as that it just began with they put themselves in a bad situation to get started. And the methodology is that if you take, for instance, our standard survey and the standard survey we would do on the presidential or for any sort of campaign across the ballot, we will do what's known as a random sample.
Right.
And just to put this in terms of science, if you think about, a lot of people say, well, why don't you have to talk to everybody? How can you take a random sample? It's sort of like taking blood. If you go to your doctor, they just take a little vial of blood. It's a random sample of your blood, and that's how they're able to determine what's wrong with you or what's right with you, as the case may be. Well, what the Los Angeles Times poll does is they have created a panel. And they call that panel back over and over again
Right.
every week to be able to determine what is happening with that panel. And so to put it in that same scientific scenario, if you looked at the same blood, you just say you pull the blood out, you examine it, you put the blood back in, and looked at the exact same blood every single time, you find the same. You might see slight changes in a person's health status, but they'd be very slight.
Right.
And that's kind of what the Times has done. Now, they made the decision up front, I think, for interesting reasons, because what they wanted to do was be able to find a group of people, and think wide range, I think it's over 3,000 respondents, a wide-ranging group of people that are representative, but are also very attuned to what's going on, so they can measure the impact of things like the Trump Access Hollywood tape, or the women who came out and made the charges against Trump last week, or the WikiLeaks information on Hillary Clinton. So all of this, they're paying attention, able to measure it, rather than getting some random person who doesn't necessarily pay attention to politics, which happens a lot in polling.
Right.
It's amazing. We'll call someone who's never heard of Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton, believe it or not. Those people exist.
Wow.
They're called undecided voters, unfortunately.
Or other things.
But what has happened with the Los Angeles Times poll is what give you one that has been well written about. There's a gentleman in Illinois, an African-American male, who is voting for Donald Trump. And because of the way this survey is conducted, and because the weighting that has to be applied, because you don't call every African-American in the United States,
Right.
You sample them, and then they're representative. Well, this African-American male probably is like you, Chris, is a conservative, and he rejects Hillary Clinton, and so he is hardcore for Trump. But what that does in the course of a 3,000-person sample, whatever it is, he represents tens of thousands of people. And let's face it, in most polling, Trump is getting less than 10% of the African-American vote. And so what you see is that the misrepresentation of just this one person can throw this entire survey off by 3 to 5 points. And there's other examples of that have taken place. And so that's really what's going on with the USC poll. Is it's not necessarily a bad poll
Right.
if you look at it for what it is meant to represent, which is just a panel of these specific people. And it's not really, even though I think they wanted to be this at the outset, it's not really an overall representative sample of all voters in the United States.
Tell me this, as you mentioned, some of these polls show Donald Trump at 0% in the African-American community. I know a lot of African Americans within the Black conservative movement that support Donald Trump. I mean, that's impossible, isn't it, for him to have 0 or 1% support when Republicans traditionally, get 10, and it's been going down since Barack Obama has been president, lower, but 0 just seems impossible to me.
Yeah, I haven't seen any that have been at 0, and that is almost impossible because. But I will say I have seen very reputable polls that have Trump getting less of the African-American vote than, say, George Wallace did when he ran for president. And so I bring that up just to say There's no question that Trump is underperforming. And frankly, I would even go so far as to argue, and let me be clear on this, it's been written that I'm never Trump, and that's not the case.
Right.
I would love to be able to vote for Donald Trump. If Donald Trump took a strong stand on conservative issues, which is what I care about, I would be for him. That's irrelevant to our conversation here, but I think it's important to lay that preface to say that if Trump is doing significant damage to the Republican brand with African Americans and Hispanics, and even though you saw a slight uptick occur there for a short period of time, I think had he at that point been able to refrain from using the sort of incendiary language that he has, and had he run anything resembling a standard campaign operation, you might have seen him start to grow into a competitive candidate. But unfortunately, he went the opposite direction, and so you're seeing him start to slip back down with the African Americans and Hispanics to a point that is starting to that is really taking him back to where he was before, to where he could create a historical level of underperformance with minority voters.
Tell me this: what's the future of polling? I know traditionally it's calling landlines. Now that you call cell phones, and some of that stuff you can block. How are you going to be able to do your job in the future?
Well, Chris, again, I'm fearful of putting your listeners to sleep.
Oh no, they're interested.
Talking too much about science, but I'll tell you what we've done, and this is I really had the opportunity, and thanks to Senator Cruz, whenever he was generous enough to allow me to work for him on his campaign, one of the greatest experiences of my life.
Me too.
And I was able to experiment a lot with different types of methodologies, and I'll tell you, I do believe that polling as the science that it is today is going away. And it's funny, I've spoken with some of my colleagues on the Democratic side about this, who did the analytics for the Obama campaign and who are doing it now for Clinton. and they're kind of moving in the same direction. And I would argue this is an area where we, when I say we, I mean we as Republicans, we as even our firm, are moving more quickly than the Democrats are, and that is moving into the use of predictive analytics right over polling. Now, it was famously said that all models are wrong, but some are useful. Right. And I think that's really what you get into, where the margin of error on a poll may only be 3% or 5%, depending on how many samples you do. You do deal with larger margins in analytics. Even your best models are only accurate at the 80 to 90 percentile range. Having said that, though, instead of dealing with percentages, you're dealing with raw numbers. So to give you an example, let's say you're running for state house in Missouri, and there's 100,000 voters. Well, if you get a survey back and it tells you 10% are undecided, there's not a whole lot you can do with that. But if you score the file and you find out there are 10,000 people that are undecided, you know exactly who those 10,000 are, it allows you to communicate with them in a different way than you might if they were just percentages represented in a survey. And so on the Cruz campaign, we really experimented a lot with message testing through social media surveys, and then really building out what we call Monte Carlo, what are known as Monte Carlo simulations with our file, with our voter file. And I think it allowed us to do things that, particularly on the Republican side, no one had ever done before, and it's why we were successful as we were.
I think, what in your bio that I read, some of the stuff that you were doing in Iowa, the way that you had these voters identified, what their interests were, all of that was just incredible. And it made going door to door and all that stuff so much easier because of that.
Yeah. Well, I agree. And I think that was really the benefit of what we were doing, is that it did take, from a door-to-door standpoint, it really allowed us to run campaigns at a different level. So instead of talking, again, in terms of percentages, we're talking to individuals about the issue they care about. And really, when it gets down to it, that's what politics should be about. I mean, if I'm talking to you about education because you fall into a certain percentile range, but you don't have kids, it's probably not of interest to you in the same way that maybe they're repealing the Iran deal, the Iran nuclear weapons treaty would be. And so really the key thing here is to find out what voters care about. And that's, to me, sort of the next level of what we're doing in politics and what I'm really passionate about.
Well, Chris, I want to thank you, for taking time out of your busy schedule and explaining all of this stuff to us, because the math and the methodology and all that stuff is way over my head. But I'm glad that we had such a professional like you to come in and explain this to us, and I really, really appreciate it, my friend.
Oh, well, happy to do it. You're very kind. I appreciate that.
Okay. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, you bet, Chris. Thanks for having me on.
That's Chris Wilson, Wilson Perkin Allen's Research. Good guy, one of the top pollsters in the business, and have known him about 10 years. Took a chance on me on a project in Oklahoma, and we've been friends ever since. And it's a friendship that I cherish. After